In the first lecture of this series, I described the Japanese strategic war objectives. In the last lecture, I described how the Japanese carried out that strategy in the first 24 hours of the war. In this lecture, I will describe the fate of the outposts that were attacked on that first day. I will describe the fall of the American outposts today, Guam and Wake. In another lecture, I will describe the fall of the Philippines. Next will be a lecture on the fall of the British outposts in Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. After Shanghai and the Marine outpost in North China, Guam was the next American outpost to fall to the Japanese in World War II. The fall of Guam did not come as a surprise since it was considered lost before the war started. It only had a token defense of 153 Marines armed with little more than rifles and a few machine guns. With the threat of war looming, the Marines dug into firing positions on the tip of the Orote Peninsula. On the first day of the war, the Japanese bombed the USS Penguin, which was eventually scuttled, and bombed the Naval Air Station, the Marine Barracks, and the Pan American facilities on the Orote Peninsula. 3 captured natives from Saipan revealed the location of the Japanese landing beaches at Duncas, north of the capital of Agana. The first day of the war ended with the Marines dug in, waiting for the expected Japanese invasion. At 8:30 on the morning of December 9th, air attacks resumed by Japanese bombers that hit the same targets they hit the day before, plus new targets in Agana. At 2:15, under cover of darkness, 370 Special Naval Landing Force troops landed at Duncas Bay. This force then advanced south and engaged Insular Force guards in Agana before continuing south to next hit the Naval Air Station at Pidi. At the same time, a second landing took place further north on the north flank of Tumon Bay. Once ashore, this force also moved south toward Agana. The main Japanese landings took place in the south at Mirizo. This force then moved north to attack the Marines at Sumai at the base of the Orote Peninsula. The main engagement took place in Agana at 4:45 in the morning. After a token resistance, a ceasefire was called at 5:45 and Governor McMillan surrendered the island at 6 o'clock. Guam was the first piece of American territory to fall to the Japanese. The American flag was lowered, and the rising sun was raised in its place. On January 10, 1942, nearly 500 American POWs were taken from Guam to Japan aboard the Argentina Maru. They arrived in Japan 5 days later and were interned at Sensuji POW camp on the island of Shikoku, where they spent the rest of the war as slave laborers. I would now like to move on to the fall of Wake. Wake is one of the loneliest atolls in the Pacific. It is a submerged volcano that consists of 3 islands, Wilkes, Peel, and Wake. Together they make up the Wake Atoll. It is fringed by a surrounding reef where waves continuously crash into a white foamy froth. The lagoon is chock full of coral heads and is difficult to access. The only entrance to the lagoon is a 50-foot wide channel between Wilkes and Wake Islands. At the time of the war, this channel was being dredged to admit larger ships and submarines. I think it is worth spending a little time with the pre-war history of this outpost. Wake was discovered in 1586 by Alvaro de Mendana, a Spanish explorer. This is the same Mendana who discovered Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was rediscovered in 1796 by the British skipper of the schooner Prince William Henry, Captain William Wake, who gave it its modern name. On December 20th, 1840, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes of the United States Navy and a famous Pacific oceanographer and explorer landed on and surveyed Wake, bringing with them the naturalist Titian Peale, who collected many new specimens, mainly of marine life. From the explorations of Wilkes and Peale, the 2 lesser islands of the atoll were eventually named. But at the time, Wake was of insufficient interest to cause Lieutenant Wilkes to take possession in the name of the United States. In March of 1866, the German ship Libelle became the only recorded shipwreck at Wake prior to the war. The Japanese also had an early interest in Wake, but not from a strategic point of view. Occasionally, they visited the atoll to collect bird feathers. On July 4, 1898, Major General Francis Greene, commanding a Philippine Expeditionary Force, ordered 2 boats ashore and raised the American flag over the island for the first time. On January 17, 1899, the visiting warship USS Bennington, commanded by Commander Edward Taussig, sent a boat ashore, hoisted a flag, fired a salute, then lowered the flag before sailing away. He was acting under orders from Washington to take possession of the atoll known as Wake Island for the United States of America. After the Bennington departed, although Wake was occasionally visited by trans-Pacific vessels, the only visitor of note was Captain John J. Pershing, who in December 1906 landed on Wake and hoisted a larger, more durable canvas American flag than the one raised by Taussig. By executive order in 1934, jurisdiction over Wake passed to the Navy Department. In May 1935, Pan American Airways, to extend their trans-Pacific route to East Asia and Australia, selected Wake as a useful intermediary base for their Philippine run. Their construction vessel, North Haven, landed supplies and equipment on Wilkes for eventual rehandling to Peel, where the Pan American Hotel and Seaplane Base was built. Once completed, the Clipper made weekly stops at Wake. I now want to put these island outposts into strategic context in the Central Pacific on the eve of war in 1941. This map indicates the various island possessions held by both Japan and the United States in 1941. The United States Navy had air and submarine bases or were improving bases at the time the war started at Guam, Midway, and Wake. These outposts were ideal fixed aircraft carriers. Wake was 1,025 miles from Midway and 1,300 miles from Guam. But Wake was only 764 miles from Japanese-held Marcus Island and only 620 miles from Roy and Namur Islands of the Kwajalein Atoll, the principal Japanese air base in the Mandates. Wake was the missing and desired link in the United States east-west, American West Coast, Pearl Harbor, Guam, Midway axis of American air and sea power. But Wake also fit equally well into the northwest, southeast, Tokyo, Iwo Jima, Marcus, Kwajalein axis of Japanese power. The Vinson Bill of May 1938 provided for an increase of 20% in ships and an increase in the Navy's aircraft strength to 3,000 planes. At the time, it was determined that the existing naval air facilities would not accommodate this increase. As a result, the Secretary of the Navy appointed a board of high-ranking naval officers to investigate the need for establishment of additional submarine and naval air bases on the coasts of the United States, its territories, and possessions. This board, called the Hepburn Board for its chairman, Admiral Arthur Hepburn, conducted an exhaustive survey of the strategic needs in connection with the naval defense of the United States and of existing facilities for meeting those needs. The board recommended to Congress the establishment of new air bases and the expansion of existing bases to provide 3 major air bases on each coast, one in the Canal Zone and one in Hawaii, with outlying operating bases in the West Indies, Alaska, and the Pacific Island possessions. There were some projects considered to be of immediate strategic importance which should be undertaken at the earliest practical date. These projects were the improvement of air facilities at Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii, submarine and air bases at Wake Island, Midway, and Guam, air facilities at Johnston and Palmyra Island, air and submarine bases in the Aleutian Islands, and air and submarine facilities at San Juan, Puerto Rico. As you can see, all of these island bases are outside the Japanese mandate. Wake lost half its strategic importance in 1939 when Congress declined to strengthen Guam. This meant that no attempt would be made to hold Guam when war broke out with Japan. But Congress did adopt in 1940 the recommendation of the Hepburn Board to develop both Midway and Wake as an air and submarine base. Eventually, 1,100 civilians began to work on Wake. They were still developing Wake's defenses when the war started and were caught up in the battle. They built the runways, 30-foot wide roads around the island, and continued dredging a channel between Wake and Wilkes Island to the lagoon. The Japanese occasionally sent up a patrol plane from the marshals to keep an eye on the construction progress. In a letter dated April 18, 1941 to Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, pointed out the strategic importance of Wake in the event of hostilities and urged that defensive measures be adopted at once. His letter was prophetic. As an operating patrol base, it could prove highly valuable to us in observing the marshals or in covering the advance of our forces toward the Saipan-Honshu line. In the hands of the Japanese, it would be a serious obstacle to surprise raids in the northern marshals or on Marcus or Saipan, and would be capable of causing serious interference with other secret movements of our forces. To deny Wake to the enemy without occupying it ourselves would be difficult. To recapture it, if the Japanese should seize it in the early period of hostilities, would require operations of some magnitude. Since the Japanese Fourth Fleet includes transports and troops with equipment especially suited for landing operation, it appears not unlikely that one of the initial operations of the Japanese may be directed against Wake. If Wake be defended, then for the Japanese to reduce it would require extended operations of their naval forces in an area where we might be able to get at them, thus offering us an opportunity to get at naval forces with naval forces. Admiral Kimmel urged that substantial components of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion Fleet Marine Force, then at Pearl Harbor, be sent to Wake by June 1st. This is the command structure in the Pacific in December of 1941. At the time of the attack on December 7th, Admiral Husband Kimmel was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. After Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel was sacked and replaced temporarily by Admiral William Pye, who would serve as SINGPAC only until his replacement arrived. Pye was replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz on December 31st at the same time that he was promoted to full admiral. Since Wake was a naval air station, it was commanded by a naval officer. Commander Winfield Cunningham took command of the Wake garrison on November 28, 1941. Commanding the 1st Marine Defense Battalion was Major James Devereaux, who arrived on Wake on October 15, 1941. On December 4, 1941, Major Paul Putnam arrived with the 12 Wildcats of VMF 211. This is the USS Enterprise ferrying the 12 Wildcats of VMF 211 and its pilot and crew to Wake. Task Force 8 departed Pearl Harbor on November 28, 1941, centered on Enterprise. This is the usual configuration of a task force at the start of the war. The ship most in need of protection, usually an aircraft carrier, was located in the center of concentric circles. The circles were about 2,000 yards apart. The inner ring of ships was usually composed of heavy and light cruisers and later battleships to provide anti-aircraft protection. The outer ring was composed of destroyers. The primary mission of the destroyers was anti-submarine protection, or ASW. In Task Force 8, Enterprise, being the most vulnerable ship and most important, was located in the center. The inner ring was composed of 3 heavy cruisers, Salt Lake City, Northampton, and Chester. The outer ring was composed of 8 destroyers. This configuration could travel in excess of 30 knots. On December 4th, Major Putnam and VMF 211 took off from Enterprise and landed their 12 Wildcat fighters onto Wake's airstrip. These planes would be the only air support Wake would have throughout the siege. This is a modern-day task force centered on a Nimitz-class carrier. This is a staged photo. The ships would not ordinarily be as close to each other as they are in this photo. This is Task Force 38. In this photo, there are at least 5 carriers surrounded by cruisers and destroyers. As you can see, they turn as a unit. This photo also illustrates the usual distance between the concentric circles of escorts. The advance element of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, 6 officers and 173 men, disembarked at Wake from the USS Regulus on August 19, 1941. Major Devereaux came out on the same ship on October 15th, bringing 3 batteries, each of 2 5-inch 51 caliber guns, 3 batteries, each of 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 24 50 caliber machine guns for anti-aircraft work, and a number of 30 caliber machine guns for beach defense. More men arrived on November 2nd, but there were never enough to man all the guns. The Marines of the Defense Battalion were equipped with 1903 Springfield rifles, khaki uniforms, and the World War I type steel helmets, sometimes referred to as a Brodie helmet. Between January and November 1941, the USS William Ward Burroughs made several trips between Honolulu and Wake to bring supplies and eventually 1,146 civilian contractors to build the airstrip and other base facilities. On November 28, 1941, the USS Wright began unloading cargo and passengers at Wake. Aboard were 43 naval personnel for the forthcoming Naval Air Station and 50 Marine ground crew for VMF 211. Also aboard was Commander Cunningham, the new island commander. One of the first things that Commander Cunningham did was to place Major Devereaux in charge of base defense. Cunningham also placed VMF 211 at Devereaux's disposal. The 1st Marine Defense Battalion was primarily an artillery battalion. Their main defensive weapon against surface threats was the 5-inch 51 caliber gun. These guns were taken from the old USS Texas. This is a portable coincidence rangefinder used in conjunction with the 5-inch coastal defense gun. It too was a relic removed from the decommissioned battleship Texas. The main anti-aircraft weapon on Wake was the 3-inch gun. Water-cooled 50 caliber machine guns provided additional anti-aircraft fire. The 5-inch guns were paired at the 3 apices of the atoll, batteries A, B, and L. Also located at these batteries were the 3-inch anti-aircraft guns and 50 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns. The 30 caliber machine guns were placed mostly at batteries A and L. The other machine guns were placed on the beach near Camp 1, but these were unmanned for lack of enough Marines. The main threat to Wake from land-based bombers was from the Japanese base in the Marshalls on Kwajalein. This is a map of the Kwajalein Atoll. Like most Pacific atolls, it was made up of small coral islets, some of which were barely big enough to accommodate an airstrip. Such was the case with the islands of Roy and Namur. This is a map of Roy and Namur in the northern part of the Kwajalein Atoll. As you can see, the airstrip takes up all of the island of Roy. On December 9th, Day 2 of the siege of Wake started with general quarters sounded at 0500, 45 minutes before sunrise. Major Devereaux ordered the defenses to Condition 1, having all phones manned and circuits checked. All weapons and fire control instruments were fully manned and battle lookouts were posted. At 0545, the 4 flyable Wildcats took off on their dawn patrol, reconnoitering 60 to 80 miles along the southern sector, the most likely route for the Japanese bombers flying up from Roy Namur. The patrol returned at 0730 with nothing to report, and Major Devereaux relaxed the defenses to Condition 2, with only half the guns manned and defense personnel rotated for work improving defensive positions. At 11:45, 26 Betty bombers came in from the south at 13,000 feet. This time they had been spotted by a lookout at Camp 1. 2 of the Wildcats that had taken off for a noon patrol dove on the bomber formation and shot one down before having to disengage because of the increasing 3-inch anti-aircraft burst coming up from the Wake gunners. Anti-aircraft fire succeeded in damaging 12 of the 26 bombers, but all but the one shot down returned to base at Roy Namur. Before breaking off, the bombers hit the guns at Battery A, damaging the rangefinder. They also hit and damaged several buildings at Camp 2 and the Naval Air Station still under construction on Peel. 4 Marines and 55 civilians were killed in the attack. Major Paul Putnam, commanding VMF 211, faced a dilemma. He had only 4 remaining serviceable Wildcats for Wake's air defense. He could not launch round-the-clock patrols, but neither could he hand the Japanese a chance to strike his Wildcats on the ground poised on the airstrip. Since he only had 15 seconds warning once the Japanese bombers were sighted, he had to play a guessing game as to when to send his planes aloft and when to order them back to Wake to rest and refuel. He and his pilots would mount one scouting mission at dawn, one at dusk, and a combat patrol for noon, the most likely time for the Japanese to attack, given the time it would take for the raid to arrive from the marshals. December 10th dawned with the expectation of a repeat of the day before. The 4 Wildcats were aloft when the Japanese raid came in from the southeast, heading for Peacock Point. The bombers plastered the guns at Battery E next to Battery A on Peacock Point. The guns at Battery E were dummy guns left to give the appearance that the battery was still there while Battery A opened up on the bombers. Battery D on Peel was hit but with little damage. On Wilkes, previously ignored by the Japanese up until now, one stick of bombs fell on the contractor's cache of 125 tons of dynamite. Amazingly, only 1 Marine was killed, 4 were wounded, and 1 civilian was left suffering from shock. Batteries L and F were also hit. Captain Elrod, aloft in one of the Wildcats, shot down 2 of the bombers. The guns of the real Battery E opened fire on the bombers and hit one, which was seen to be on fire and smoking badly, as the formation headed back to the marshals. On December 11th, Major Devereaux sounded general quarters at 0300 after receiving a report that ships were sighted off the southern coast of Wake and Wilkes. After conferring with Major Putnam, he ordered the 4 remaining Wildcats aloft. Devereaux also ordered all gun batteries to stay camouflaged and to hold their fire until he gave the order to fire. Off Wake's southern shore, Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka had arrived with his invasion force and had taken up positions for landing his troops. While 450 Special Naval Landing Force troops prepared to board their landing craft, the 3 cruisers of the invasion force lined up broadside to the beach to begin the pre-invasion bombardment. Admiral Kajioka had his flag aboard the heavy cruiser Yubari in the van of the invasion force. In line behind Yubari were the light cruiser Tatsuta and Tenryū and 6 destroyers. On the left flank were 2 transports bearing the invasion troops, and on the right flank were 2 patrol craft, converted destroyer transports. These are elite Japanese soldiers of the Special Naval Landing Forces, sort of Japanese Marines. This is the light cruiser Yubari, Kajioka's flagship. This is one of 2 patrol boats, an old converted destroyer transport. This is Hayate, one of 6 destroyer escorts. By 0500, as dawn was breaking over Wake, the Yubari reached a point 8,000 yards south of Peacock Point and, turning westward, began her first run, followed by the other 2 cruisers and the rest of the squadron's ships. At 0522, the ships commenced firing on targets along the southern shore of Wake Island proper. Camp 1 took several hits and diesel tanks were set afire. Kajioka's ships received no return fire from Wake, but the 5-inch guns of Battery A at Peacock Point were tracking their targets. Twice, they had to be reminded of Major Devereaux's order to hold fire. By 0600, it was full daylight. Kajioka's ships had reversed their broadside run just west of Wilkes and, closing their distance offshore, had conducted an west to east run. Having reached Peacock Point, the Japanese battle line reversed course again and closed her distance off Wake to 6,000 yards now well within the range of Battery A's 5-inch guns. At 06:15, Devereaux gave the command to open fire. They hit the lead cruiser Yubari with their first salvo on her port side amidships just above the waterline. She was hit again by the second salvo and began burning. She turned to port to hide in her smoke screen. Battery A also hit Patrol Boat 33. It too turned away and fled. Destroyer Division 29 broke off from the bombardment tract of the cruisers near its western terminus. They headed directly for shore, firing as they closed. At approximately 4,000 yards, they executed a left turn, and the lead ship, the destroyer Hayate, was hit by a salvo fired from Battery L. She then turned away from wake and retreated, hidden in a cloud of smoke. The gun crew at Battery L firing at Hayate. Hayate was swallowed up in a violent explosion. Within 2 minutes, she had disappeared from sight, taking all aboard down with her. There were no survivors. Meanwhile, Destroyer Division 30 was proceeding west of Cuckoo Point on a northwesterly course. At a range of 10,000 yards, shortly after 0600, the division steamed into the field of fire from Battery B, which immediately opened fire, hitting the two ships. The destroyers fired on the battery before turning south and heading back to Kwajalein under cover of a smoke screen. This is a photo of the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer Kisaragi. Major Putnam's 4 Wildcats had been aloft since dawn. They now pounced on the retreating destroyers. Captain Elrod planted a 100-pound bomb on the deck of the Kasiragi. She began to slow and then disappeared in a violent explosion and sank beneath the waves without a trace. There were no survivors. Nearly every day through December 22nd, the Japanese bombed the atoll from their bases in the Marshalls as softening up for another attempt at an invasion. It was almost 9 months since Admiral Kimmel had written that the defense of Wake would force the Japanese to deploy a part of their fleet, thus affording us an opportunity to get at naval forces with naval forces. We should try by every possible means to get the Japanese to expose naval units. To make this prophecy come true, he conceived a plan to relieve the beleaguered garrison at Wake. It would be the most formidable naval operation of 1941. Conceived on December 9th in the wake of attacks across the Pacific, it was doomed to failure by delays and the Japanese speed of attacks. It was to involve all 3 fast carriers already in the Pacific, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Lexington. Lexington was to execute a diversionary raid on the Marshall Islands in the hope of pinning down Japanese air and surface forces. Enterprise was to operate westward of Johnston Island in order to cover Oahu and, if necessary, to support the main strike at Wake. The actual relief of Wake, the principal mission, went to Saratoga. Saratoga was chosen for the relief since she was already on her way from San Diego to Pearl Harbor with VMF 221, which included 18 Brewster Buffaloes to reinforce VMF 211. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded Task Force 14 and hoisted his flag on Saratoga. Seaplane tender Tangier at Pearl Harbor, promptly loaded with supplies, ammunition, and equipment for the beleaguered Marine Defense Battalion at Wake, awaited the arrival of Saratoga to proceed. The fleet oiler USS Natchez accompanied the task force. Task Force 14 got underway from Pearl Harbor on December 15th with Tangier and Natchez escorted by 4 destroyers. Aboard Tangier were 210 officers and men of the 4th Marine Defense Battalion. As Task Force 14 left Pearl Harbor, Saratoga, having recently arrived from San Diego, was refueling. The next day, December 16th at 11:15, Saratoga and her escorts departed Pearl Harbor and eventually caught up with Task Force 14 on December 17th. Saratoga was escorted by 3 heavy cruisers, Minneapolis, Astoria, and San Francisco, and 5 destroyers. This was Task Force 14's sailing configuration after the two groups linked up at sea on their way to Wake on December 17th. Task Force 8, centered on Enterprise, was the backup for Saratoga and to cover Hawaii. Task Force 11, centered on Lexington, was to make a diversionary raid on the Marshalls. On November 29th, Major Walter Baylor and 48 Marines arrived at Wake on board the USS Wright. Their mission was to establish facilities at the airfield for air-ground communications. They set up their radio in a tent near the main runway on Wake. Major Baylor worked closely with both Commander Cunningham and Major Devereaux, and with Major Putnam. During the battle, Major Baylor provided rudimentary fighter direction without the aid of radar. He relayed observation reports from Marine spotters to Marine fighters overhead in the combat air patrol. Baylor had follow-on orders to report to Midway by first available air transport to carry out the same mission there. On the evening of December 20th, a United States Navy PBY landed on Wake's lagoon. When it departed the next morning, Major Baylor was on board, giving him the distinction of being the last man off Wake Island. At the time, it was imperative for the Marine Corps to get Major Baylor off the Wake because he was one of the few Marine officers who had experience establishing air-ground communication networks, and he was knowledgeable of the still top-secret radar program within the United States. On the morning of December 21st, Admiral Kajioka set sail from his base in the Marshalls with an invasion force that included 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 1 auxiliary seaplane tender, 2 patrol boats, and 3 medium transports. This time he came with an invasion force of 1,000 Special Naval Landing Force troops and 1,500 Navy landing troops. He also had at his disposal ground support aircraft from the carriers Soryu and Hiryu. The Japanese began landing at 0235 after a preliminary bombardment. The ex-destroyer patrol boats 32 and 33 were beached and burned in their attempts to land the invasion force. Fighting raged across the islands all night and into the morning. Dan Teeters was the boss of the civilian construction team contracted to dredge the channel and improve the runways. He was a World War I veteran from Ohio with a degree in engineering. Although most fled into the brush, he and a handful of other civilians volunteered to fight with the Marines. By dawn, Major Putnam's men and the men of Lieutenant Hanna's gun were hard-pressed and completely surrounded. Having lost their planes, the surviving pilots and ground crews of VMF-211 had taken up rifles as infantrymen. Almost all of Putnam's men were either already dead or wounded, including Captain Henry Elrod, who was killed from a burst of Japanese fire. With the defenders being hard-pressed on Wake Island, with no word from Wilkes Island, Commander Cunningham sent the following message to Singpat: "Enemy on the island. Issue in doubt." With the coming of dawn, the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carriers Soryu and Hiryu launched all of their planes in a maximum effort to support the Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops. They bombed and strafed every identifiable target and were opposed only by the guns of Battery E. With the morning light, the defense of Wake had been reduced to small pockets of continued resistance by Marines who would not give up. By 0700, the position on Wake looked very bad to Major Devereaux. With no word from the defenders on Wilkes, Japanese aircraft attacking at will, enemy troops advancing on his command post next to the airstrip, and the sight of so many Japanese ships out to sea, presumably carrying more landing force troops, Devereaux conferred with Commander Cunningham, asking whether any friendly forces were at hand to relieve them. Cunningham replied that there were no friendly forces within 24 hours of Wake. Given these circumstances, Commander Cunningham ordered the island surrendered. Major Devereaux moved out from his command post to pass the word to all units to surrender. One of the lingering controversies of the war was the fate of the Wake Island relief effort, Task Force 14. I would like to describe in brief the fate of that effort begun on December 15, 1941, by Admiral Kimmel. From the start, the relief mission was plagued by an almost unbelievable series of delays, variously blamed on weather, refueling mishaps, and submarine scares. Heavy seas slowed the progress of the screening destroyers. Refueling while underway in any kind of weather was an art yet to be perfected. Bogus submarine contacts were rife. The arrival of Saratoga was further delayed by weather. Because of the slow speed of the oiler Nietzsche's, the task force could only make 13 knots. Moreover, Admiral Pye was being urgently reminded by Washington that Hawaii was exposed, and what business did the fleet have in supporting a distant outpost with little military value when the main American stronghold was thought to be vulnerable? The cruel reality, as Pye, Kimmel, and the Washington admirals all understood and conceded, was that Wake was a liability. Sooner or later, Japan would seize it. Though the ostensible aim of the expedition was still to reinforce the garrison and air group on Wake, the fallback plan was to evacuate the atoll completely. Most important of all was not to lose any of the precious remaining carriers, even if 1,500 men on Wake had to be abandoned to the enemy. The survival of the carriers was Pye's overarching concern. On December 20th, Pye gave serious consideration to ordering Task Force 14 back to Pearl, but relented in the face of hot-blooded dissent from his SINCPAC staff. On December 21st, Pye began to vacillate over what to do. That day, Pye ordered Admiral Fletcher on Saratoga to steam full speed ahead for Wake and launch the planes of VMF-221 at a range of 200 miles. He soon countermanded that order. Instead, he ordered Tangier to steam at peak speed to embark the garrison and bring them to safety. Not an hour had passed before that order was also revoked. Conditions on Wake were growing desperate. By the end of the day, the last of the Wildcats had been shot down and the other crashed. The island had no air defenses at all. Reports kept coming into SINCPAC at Pearl Harbor that Task Force 14 refueling problems were getting worse, and thus putting their ships at risk. Not the least were the carriers. Pye had heard enough. At 0911 on December 22nd, he gave the order to recall all of the carriers back to Pearl Harbor. The order was received with great resentment. On Saratoga's flag bridge, there was loose talk of ignoring the withdrawal order. The Marine airmen on Saratoga, who had been ready to fly to Wake to relieve their colleagues, threatened to climb into their planes and go. Rear Admiral Fitch on Saratoga was forced to withdraw to his cabin so that he would not overhear any of the mutinous talk on his bridge. For many in Hawaii, both military and civilian, December 23rd was the single worst day of the war. The cancellation of the Wake relief operation coincided with ominous news from the Philippines. Japanese transports were pouring troops onto the beaches of Luzon and Leyte without opposition, and General MacArthur had fled Manila. The United States had no realistic hope of sending reinforcements or supplies to the Philippines. They would probably be abandoned and conceded to the Japanese, as Wake had been. By 0800 on December 22nd, Wake time, Task Force 14 was only 515 miles from Wake. By 0800 the next day, Task Force 14 was still 420 miles from Wake. This was as close as they would get before being recalled back to Pearl Harbor. By noon, it was all over. Despite intense opposition, Major Devereaux convinced his Marines to surrender. At 2:30, the American flag was lowered and replaced by the Japanese flag. Throughout December 23rd, the Japanese rounded up the survivors. Stripped and bound, they were herded onto the airstrip where they were made to kneel, facing machine guns. Their worst fears about Japanese treatment of prisoners appeared to be about to come true. Only with the timely appearance of Rear Admiral Kajioka, and after much heated discussion, where the machine guns stood down. All the men on Wake were treated as prisoners of war, including the civilians. All the prisoners were used as forced labor to clean up Wake. In January 1942, the Nita Maru arrived off Wake to take the prisoners to prison camps in China. 388 civilian contractors and the wounded were retained on Wake to construct the Japanese defenses and airstrip. Of the men kept on Wake as laborers, 45 died of malnutrition. About 200 were shipped to Japan in September 1942, leaving 98 specialist contractors on Wake. After they had completed the tasks of building defensive positions, they were lined up on Wilkes Island and machine-gunned to death. One prisoner managed to survive and remained hidden for a couple of days before he was finally found. He was summarily beheaded. The Marines and civilians from Wake were interned at a POW camp at Wusong outside Shanghai, China. The Marines from Shanghai and North China were also interned at this camp. Additionally, there were 48 British POWs in this camp. This photo shows the senior American officers in the camp. Colonel Ashurst and Major Brown, Marines of the 4th Marines from Shanghai and North China, is seated here with Major Devereaux. Walter Baylor, now Colonel Baylor, the last man off Wake prior to the battle and surrender on December 23, 1941, is the first American to set foot back on the island when he came ashore on September 4, 1945, as part of the American delegation accepting the surrender of the Japanese garrison. This is a photo of Admiral Sakabara surrendering to the Marines on September 4, 1945. The officer with the pipe in his hand in the middle is Colonel Walter Baylor, the last man off Wake and the first to return. The American flag goes back over Wake on September 4, 1945, there to stay. This is what is referred to as the POW Rock. It is located on Wilkes Island. Inscribed in the rock is 98 USPW, the 5th of October, 1943. This inscription was carved by the lone survivor of the 98 civilians left on Wake to build Japanese defenses and who were later gunned down. His name remains unknown to this day. He was beheaded by Admiral Sakabara shortly after he was found by the Japanese. Admiral Sakabara was tried and convicted of war crimes after the war. He was sentenced to death and was hanged on Guam on June 18, 1947. Lastly, I would like to honor the only Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of Wake. It was awarded posthumously to the widow of Captain Henry Elrod. In part, his Medal of Honor citation reads, "During the defense of Wake, Captain Elrod repeatedly displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. On the 12th of December, he single-handedly attacked a flight of 22 enemy planes and shot down 2. On several flights, he executed low-altitude bombing and strafing runs on enemy ships and became the first man to sink a major warship with small-caliber bombs delivered from a fighter-type aircraft. When his plane was destroyed by hostile fire, he organized a unit of ground troops into a beach defense and repulsed repeated Japanese attacks until he fell, mortally wounded. Captain Elrod was killed in action defending Wake Island against the invading Japanese on the 23rd of December, 1941.